Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tueller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on February 2nd with James Tanner. He will be giving a presentation entitled Moving Beyond Birth, Marriage, and Death Records. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Kathryn Grant, who will be giving a presentation on best practices for entering information in FamilySearch Family Tree Part 1, General Principles. Before we begin, here is a little bit about Kathryn. After years on the sidelines, Kathryn began doing family history. Somewhat to her surprise, she discovered that she loved it. Her specialty is helping new family historians find success and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes she's made. Kathryn teaches Sunday classes at the BYU Family History Library and presents at other family history events. Her column on family history ran in the Nauvoo Times for about a year and is still available online. In addition, she's a regular contributor to the Family Search blog. Kathryn works as a technical writer and instructional designer with a focus on usability and process improvement. Her current work assignment includes developing training used on mobile devices. Besides family history, she loves uplifting music, thought-provoking books, and fresh raspberries. And if Kathryn is ready, we can go ahead and turn the time over to her.
Great, Olivia, thank you so much. So I will just share my screen here. Okay. Well, everybody, welcome to this webinar today. Again, we've got a super exciting topic and one that is very relevant to the work that we're doing in Family Tree. So I'm just moving the Zoom menu out of the way. There we go. So today's class is the first class of 2 on a series of best practices for adding information to the FamilySearch Family Tree. And those of you who are listening or watching later, you're probably going to be delighted to know that I started this webinar as one webinar and it got too long. I thought there's no way this is like going to take a couple of hours. And so I split it into 2 parts. So this one will probably be a little shorter than usual, but that's not a bad thing, right? And so please join us for part 2 and I'll give you more information on that near the end of this webinar. So let's get started with part 1, general principles. Today, this is what we've got on the schedule. First of all, we'll have a brief introduction, and after that, we will talk about why best practices matter in a shared tree. And finally, we will actually give the best practices. So, introduction. I did want to make clear at the beginning that what we're talking about are best practices, but they aren't any kind of official family search or church policies or even hard and fast rules. Rather, these best practices are based on experience and also how Family Tree actually works. So I don't know if you've noticed this. I've noticed it in my own life and I've seen it on in Facebook groups that I belong to, but there can be a lot of wrong assumptions about how Family Tree works. And actually it's not limited to Family Tree. We see that all around us in our lives with different software, with anything. You know, we make assumptions as best we can, but then a lot of times we find out that those assumptions weren't true. And our assumptions, of course, if they're wrong, affect what we do in any endeavor, and particularly in Family Tree. So hopefully we'll maybe clear up some misconceptions today and also give those best practices that will help you be successful as possible. I did want to point out that the purpose of this webinar is not to make anybody feel burdened or discouraged. One reason, well, let me share a little example of why I'm saying that. So a few months ago, I think it was last year, I was speaking at a family history conference, and one of the topics was the importance of doing correct merges in Family Tree, which some of you may be aware, merges can be tricky, and if they're done incorrectly, they can snowball into all kinds of problems. And so I was trying to caution people to be careful and use good judgment. And afterwards, a woman came up and said, "Oh my goodness, you've just made me scared to do merges." Well, part of me wanted to say, maybe that's a good thing. A little caution is probably good. But on the other hand, I did not want anybody to leave the class feeling discouraged or feeling like they couldn't do what they needed to do. So I just wanted to make that clear up front that the purpose of today's class is not to make people feel burdened or discouraged or like they can't do what they need to do. But on the other hand, the purpose is to empower and encourage you by giving you tools to, first of all, create an accurate tree and then also avoid mistakes and confusion. So with that as our little introduction, let's talk briefly about why best practices matter in a shared tree. Just in case anybody is wondering, what are you talking about when you say shared tree? Well, most trees on websites are personal. On just about every website, ancestry.com, Find My Past, My Heritage, when somebody creates a tree, it's their tree, right? They own it. They can choose who gets to see it. They can choose who adds information to it. They control it. But Family Search's family tree is a completely different endeavor. It is a shared tree of all humanity, and we're all working together on it. So that means because Family Tree is a shared tree, what we do in Family Tree impacts other users. So let's look at that in a little more detail. So in a shared tree, all users see virtually all information, pretty much, right? Pretty much all information. There are a few exceptions to that, such as living people. That's a good example of an exception. We can, as users, we can only see the living people that we add. There's some other sensitive records that are not visible, but really like 99% of the information in the tree is visible to everybody. Well, what that means is since it's a shared tree, people come to Family Tree assuming that the information is correct, especially new users, because why would you bother to go to a tree where the information is not correct? And so that's an assumption, maybe a little bit too much on the side of correctness. I mean, that is our goal, right? But right now, there are errors in Family Tree and most users come in not realizing that or maybe not recognizing it. And so they don't verify the information. Well, when the information is right, that's no problem. But if the information happens to be wrong, people may add incorrect information in relationships and they may do incorrect merges to the people that they're working on. Well, then what happens is that wrong information causes even more confusion because, again, people come along and they don't necessarily realize it's wrong. Here's the other major thing that is so important to keep in mind. Family Tree has a genius design, and that is that it dishes up record hints or hints for sources and hints for possible duplicates. The thing is, those hints rely on correct information. And if the information is wrong on the person page, guess what? The likelihood that it dishes up wrong hints is very strong because it's relying on the information on the page. What else can it rely on, right? It has to use what we give it. So if we give it good information, it returns good hints. If bad information sneaks in there, the hints are not necessarily valid. Well, as a result, once a few errors get made, especially bad merges, they tend to snowball instead of getting fixed. But a day of reckoning always comes, just like it does in life, in family history, and pretty much any other endeavor. Eventually, excuse me, somebody's going to need to clean up those problems. And as we've probably all discovered to our chagrin sometimes, it's always harder and it takes more time after the problems snowball. So, to change metaphors just a little bit here, how many of you remember? If you want, you can hit raise hand. We can't actually respond to raise hands, but I can see your raise hands, like the little icon thing. How many of you remember this poem about the ambulance in the valley? It's quite a delightful poem. You can Google it if you want to read the whole thing. But the basic premise is there was this city, someplace or town, and it had a cliff nearby. And so people would go to the cliff, and unfortunately, sometimes people would fall over the edge of the cliff. So the people in the town had a big discussion. And they said, we obviously this is not good. We've got people falling over the cliff, but we need to do something about it. And some people said, well, why don't we build a fence? That makes the most sense. Let's put a fence at the top of the cliff. But the majority of the people said, "No, that's too much trouble. That's not worth it. Let's just put an ambulance in the valley because if people are careful, it's okay. And so we don't really need a fence, and we'll just put the ambulance in the valley." But the poem goes on to say, that really didn't solve the problem because people kept falling over the edge of the cliff and the ambulance kept having to go. And somebody asks in the poem, wouldn't it have been so much better to solve the root problem and stop people from falling rather than have these ambulances? So, same thing applies in family history. We want to put a fence at the top of the cliff to help us all as we're building our shared tree. And so, the best practices that we're going to talk about today are like that fence. So, with that being said, let's go over general best practices. And I should mention one other thing about the split between these two webinars. The practices today are going to be very high level and just general principles. Next time, we're actually going to talk about the rules that Family Search has for entering information in fields and best practices and how to avoid mistakes at a very specific level. But today, we're going to keep it general. So, the first best practice took me a number of years to figure out. So, maybe a lot of you have wanted to do family history for a long time. Maybe people have been urging you to get into it, and maybe you've even felt a little guilty, like I did for quite a while until I started doing it. And then once you start doing it, there's like this residual feeling of stress. Can anybody relate to that? How family history can sometimes turn into a stressful thing, which is not good, right? In anything that we do, stress just tends to make things worse. So, the first best practice that I would offer is to relax when you're doing family history. And if you find yourself stressing, just give yourself a minute to take a deep breath and try and ask yourself what you're stressing about. Is it that you don't know what you need to do, or you found problems that you're not sure how to resolve? Whatever it is, take a deep breath. Think about how you could productively solve that. And this is good advice for other things in our life too, right? But it is really good in family history. And the other thing that relaxing helps with is to get to a place where we're being still mentally. And so some of you who've have been in my other classes have heard me talk about this, where it's kind of a recent thing that I've realized I need to improve in my life. I need to cut out the mental chatter, cut out the constant barrage of input, whether it's from social media or whatever it might be, and just take some time to really be still and hear what my inner voice is telling me, and then to listen to that inner voice. So it depends on your faith tradition what you might call that inner voice. Those of us who are Christians would call it the Holy Spirit. but that is not you don't have to call it the same thing in order to benefit from it. So in some of the literature I've read, people call it the divine voice or inner wisdom or whatever it might be. Again, I don't think the name is quite so important as recognizing that we have this inner voice that we can listen to. And I found that this inner voice is very active in family history if we will stop and be still and listen to it. So that's my first best practice that I wanted to recommend. The next one is to focus on people and accuracy rather than numbers. The crazy thing about focusing on numbers is that when we do it, we tend to cut corners and we tend to make mistakes. And this again is not unique to family history. In just about any endeavor, if we let our focus shift to the numbers, then we start doing things to get the numbers instead of perhaps more important goals. So when we focus on the right things, interestingly enough, the numbers tend to take care of themselves. So if you find yourself obsessed with numbers, or one thing I have noticed in the family history community is that sometimes people measure their worth by numbers. You'll hear someone say, I added such and such a number of names this month, or I got a family history book and it was awesome. And I was, from my family, it was on this certain line and I took it and I was able to add 50,000 names. And then other people hear that and they think, oh my goodness, if I'm not adding as many names as Mr. So-and-so, then I must not be a good family historian. And I wish that we could just get away from that comparison. There are times when someone is really phenomenally blessed and they get a wonderful family book or parish register or whatever, and they are able to add a large portion of names. But that doesn't happen often in my experience, and it doesn't diminish a person's worth or contribution if they don't add a large number of names. The important thing is to focus on priorities and goals and not make it into a numbers game. Okay, the next thing is to avoid rushing, and this is kind of related to the other two best practices. I'm going to tell you a story that is not one of my finer moments, but I feel like it illustrates the point really well. So you notice in this little image here, we've got some broken glass. This is not actually from the story that I'm going to tell you, but I didn't take a picture at the time. So I had to find one that was kind of representative. But I have a friend, well, she's actually deceased now, but a dear friend of mine, and I like looking into tradition, or I would say alternative health methods, like we like natural remedies and things like that. She moved to another state and asked if I could get some herbs that she was unable to get in her area and send them to her. Well, at the time, I was really busy, and I have to admit, to my shame, that I was put off by her request, even though she was a dear friend. And I was kind of annoyed, like, doesn't she know how busy I am? And so I went ahead and got the stuff. I told her I'd do it, and I bought the herbs. And as I recall, they came in a glass container. Either that or I packaged them in a glass container. I think I bought them that way, though, because otherwise I probably wouldn't have packaged them in glass. This has been quite a few years back. So I packaged up the box, and as I was packaging it to mail it to her, I thought, oh, dang it, I should probably do a little better padding, but you know what? Too bad. I don't have time. I'm busy. She asked for this, so she's just going to have to take what she can get. I'm just going to send it with some minimal padding and hope for the best. Well, you can kind of imagine what happened on the other end when my friend got her package. And I think I did write fragile on the package, but it didn't help. So she got the package and the glass had broken and mixed in with the herbs, and basically they were ruined. You can't eat food with glass in it. So she told me, she said, yeah, I got your package, but unfortunately the glass was broken. And I felt so bad. And so I apologized and offered to get another container and send it better, packaged in a better way. And she said, nah, don't bother. And I can't say that I blame her, to be honest. And so I tried to save time by rushing, and it ended up costing more time. It took longer for my friend to get what she needed. If she had been willing to let me send it, that again would have taken longer time. It would have been so much better if I'd just taken that little bit of time to package carefully or repackage it in a non-breakable container, whatever. But yes, it would have taken a little bit of an investment up front, but it would have saved me time in the long run. At work, we have this, or had at one of my previous jobs, we had this sign hanging up on somebody's door, reminding us of how important it was not to rush. And the sign said these words at the bottom of the screen: if you don't have time to do it right, how will you find time to do it over? True words. So when you work carefully and diligently at a relaxed pace, the irony is that you accomplish much more. So here I've got some symbolic glass containers that are whole and not broken, and they represent relaxing and being careful and diligent and not cutting corners. Okay, the next best practice is to get your ducks in a row. What do I mean by that? Aren't these little ducklings just the cutest? I just love them. So, by get your ducks in a row, what I mean is do the research before you enter information in Family Tree. There are some misconceptions going around about information in Family Tree, and actually, once you've used it, it doesn't take too long to realize these are misconceptions, but I still hear them from time to time. The misconception is, oh, you can just put whatever into Family Tree. It doesn't have to be complete, it doesn't even have to be accurate, and Family Tree will give you the right information. That would be nice, right? That sounds like magic. Unfortunately, we're not dealing with magic. And if you give Family Tree bad information, there's pretty good chance that it's going to give you bad information back. We'll actually talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But definitely do the research before you enter the information in Family Tree. Don't expect Family Tree to compensate for poor research. Another best practice I've found as far as getting my ducks in a row is to work by individual families when possible. And I wasn't quite sure what to call this. Some people call it nuclear families, not meaning like nuclear bombs, but meaning nucleus. So basically, what I'm meaning here is parents and their children, but not just an individual and not multiple generations, but parents and children. What I found is if I work on one individual in complete isolation, I don't have the context I need. On the other hand, if I get bogged down in multiple generations, I get too many rabbit holes. So what I found, at least for me, is it helps to limit my scope to one family at a time. So that I research the mom, the dad, the kids carefully, get them in Family Tree. Then I move on to the next mom, dad, kids. So that, I don't know, for me, that just seems to work a lot better. The next thing is to check multiple sources, especially with the availability of so many sources today, easily at our fingertips on the internet. We almost never need to rely on just one source. And indeed, whenever we do, it increases the chance of error exponentially. So always try to cross check, make sure if you see one source, check some other sources and make sure that they agree. If there's contradictions, do some research, but definitely rely on multiple sources. That will give you the best quality. And then finally, use a tool similar to the timeline grid. I'm not going to go into detail about it, but just very briefly, it's a table, it's a grid where you can plug in information, and it actually helps you make sure that you have checked all the normal sources. And it's used mostly in countries and time periods where you have censuses. So you're trying to get all the census information and all the birth, marriage, death information, and we're not talking here about exhaustive years of research or going into tax records and land records and whatever. We're just talking about the most common sources that will give you the best information reasonably quickly. So put that little bit of effort into getting those easily available sources, and it makes a huge difference. So the next best practice, again, these kind of all tie together. The next best practice is to avoid GIGO. How many of you have heard that acronym before? It's popularly used in IT, in information technology. Yeah, a couple of people are raising their hands. And it's also used in mathematics. And the basic principle is if you give garbage to a mathematical formula or to a computer application, the chances are very good that you're going to get garbage on the other end. So you put bad stuff in, you're probably going to get bad stuff out. So I wanted to define here what I mean by low quality information. That just basically means it's either badly incomplete and or unreliable. For instance, what do I mean by unreliable? Well, Aunt Martha has a GEDCOM file that she got from her sister's cousin's brother who said their Aunt Susie. Do you see what I'm saying? Where it's just there's not sources, it's a lot of hearsay. So whenever we can't substantiate the information, it tends to be low quality. The trouble with low quality information is that it plays into this GIGO. It confuses other users and it generates incorrect possible duplicates and that should be singular right there, you guys, sorry. That should be incorrect possible duplicate hints and incorrect record hints. So we want to avoid GIGO. We want to make sure that we're giving good information to Family Tree. So here are a couple of examples. I kind of mentioned a little bit of an exaggeration with the GEDCOM. The principle here is to avoid mass additions of unverified names. So this can apply to synchronization actually too. I don't know if you've noticed this in Family Tree, but almost every time I see a reason statement that says GEDCOM data, the data is pretty bad. It's pretty low quality. It doesn't have to be. So I don't want this to come across as a denunciation of GEDCOMs because you can prepare a GEDCOM file very carefully, check it carefully, and upload it, and everything's fine. It's just that usually when I've seen GEDCOMs uploaded, they have been low quality. So if you do choose to do GEDCOMs, just make sure you verify the names. So again, the principle is not so much the GEDCOM or the mass additions, but the problem arises when people don't do the verifications. The trouble is the mass additions tend to play into the numbers game. The reason people will usually do mass additions, in my experience, I can't speak for other people's experience, but in my experience, the reason they usually do it is because they're feeling a little bit impatient and they want to get a lot of names added quickly. The trouble is, again, very often that means cutting corners. And so low quality information is added to the tree. And again, another GIGO example is adding information based on just one record because it's almost impossible to be confident of quality if you only check one record. And again, we don't have any, I guess I'd say, excuse nowadays, except maybe in very early time periods. But if we're working in most countries in the 1800s or 1900s, there are so many records available to us. So if we just invest that little bit of extra time, the quality rises to a great degree. The great thing about GIGO is it's got an opposite. So the opposite is also true. If you feed good quality into a system or a formula or whatever, very likely you're going to get good quality out. So when you carefully add accurate information, you make the tree better overall and you help other users too. So it's a win-win. Last thing, after your ducks are in the water, validate and attach family search record hints. So the reason and by ducks in the water, I mean you've added the people and stuff to Family Tree, and now you're starting to add additional things. So once you add a person, you may see record hints pop up on the right-hand side of the person page. You want to check those record hints to make sure they really do apply to that person. And I have to give kudos here to Family Search because in my experience, I would say about gosh, between 95 and 98% of the time, those record hints on that right-hand side of the person page really are for the person that I'm working on. But there are exceptions. There are occasions where I've seen a hint and I get into it and go, oh dear, it's the same name and it's maybe about the same year or close to the same place. But the more I check on it, oh, the parents are different or the place is too different and I know it's too far away. It can't be the same person. The siblings are wrong, whatever it might be. So take just a few minutes to look at those record hints, make sure they really apply to the person that you just added. And here's another thing that can be so beneficial and actually really exciting. And that is that make sure that the information on the sources is entered into the person page. Let me give an example. Suppose that I added John Bescovy. I'll pull a Bescovy name out of my hat. I love that line. So suppose I add John Bescovy to Family Tree and I've got his birth date, his birthplace, his wife, his kids, his parents. So I've got him pretty well documented. Um, I've even maybe got some sources in there already, and his identity is established very carefully. Well, Family Search in our little example, suppose they pop up a death record and I didn't have a death date before. So I look at the death record and it lists his correct parents, it lists his correct birthplace, it lists witnesses that I know are members of the family, whatever it might be. So I'm very confident that that death record is correct. Well, I look on the death record, and not only does it have a death date, but it has a death place and it has a burial location. So, in our example, this is information that I didn't have before. Well, it was right there in the source, but if I don't take a few minutes to look at that source and see what additional information it has, then I'm kind of losing out. And so I can take that information and actually enter it into the person page so that everybody else can see that. The great thing is when you add more accurate information to a person in Family Tree, it will bring up even more correct record hints, and occasionally it'll find some possible duplicates that it didn't find before. Here's another one that I feel very, very strongly about, and that is to use good reason statements. They're very helpful for other users and they can be helpful for you. I've come back to people that I've added and added sources to maybe years later, and then I wonder what I was thinking. If I look in the reason statement, I can look and see what my thoughts were and what my reasoning process was. Reason statements don't have to be long or complicated. They just kind of have to hit the high points of what your thought process was and why you did what you did, whether it was a merge or whether it was attaching a source or editing information, whatever it might be. But explain what your thought process was, and that's just going to be such a help to you and other users. And then attach any other sources. So in step one, we're talking about Family Search record hints. But in your research, when you were getting your ducks in a row, you might have found sources just in historical records which didn't show up as hints. Or you might have found something on Ancestry, ancestry.com, that is not currently in the Family Search collection. So those are sources that you also want to attach. And then finally, again, as you do that, sometimes Family Search does come up with duplicates because you've given it good information and then it can recognize other duplicates in the system. So those are the general best practices that we're sharing today. And I just wanted to conclude by saying that when you follow best practices, you are practicing good family tree citizenship. Working in Family Tree is just like being a good member of a society or a community. if we focus on the good of the community, it's just so much better than if we're either ignoring it or maybe focusing on selfish interests or whatever it may be. Anytime we work in a community, it's good to be a good citizen of that community. Best practices are a way to do that. You make things easier for yourself and for other users, and you help achieve the goal of Family Tree, which is ultimately to build an accurate record of the human family. So in summary, best practices can help you create an accurate tree, avoid mistakes and confusion. They help other users. And here are the best practices we talked about today. Relax. Don't give in to stress. Be still. Listen to that inner voice. Focus on people and accuracy rather than numbers. Avoid rushing. Get your ducks in a row. Avoid garbage in, garbage out. And then after you add people, add sources and check again for duplicates. So just a teaser for our next webinar. It's going to be on February 9th, right, Olivia? Oh dear, I hope I got the date right. I should have put it on the slide, but I believe it's February 9th, so next month. If you're watching this recording and it's already after February 9th, 2023, then look up that recording in February. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And I see that there's a question in the Q&A, so I will take that and then we'll address any questions that were put in the chat. So Darl has a comment. She says, when I first started with Family Tree, I had received 600 names from a person who professed to be a professional genealogy. Oh dear. But Darl goes on to say they had a multitude of record errors, and I have spent many hours correcting that original information. Darrell, thank you for making that point. You know, back years ago, people did the best they could, honestly, with the technology that they had. Before the internet, you had to go to courthouses or write overseas or whatever it was. It was hard to do good genealogy. So I never want to criticize anybody. Oh, I'm so sorry, Darrell. I thought before that Darl just put in the chat, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right because I thought you said it rhymed with Carl. But in an earlier class, I thought that you had said that you were a woman, and I am wrong. Darl said he is a male. So, Darl, I very much apologize for getting that wrong, and I will not get it wrong in the future because I know you come to these classes frequently. So, Darl had to go through and spend hours correcting that information. But Darl, bless you for doing that because that means that you added accurate information to Family Tree or that you cleaned up problems. So that is very much that's a great example for all of us. Okay, that takes care of everything in the Q&A. Olivia, do we have any comments or questions that we need to address in the chat?
Yeah, it looks like it's just comments for now, no questions, but
Okay.
we can read those. We do have a bit of time.
Yeah, this was shorter than usual. I would love to hear it, you guys. I had some people on Facebook say, I wish the webinars were a little bit shorter just because I don't have a lot of time. So those of you who are here today who have been to the other longer webinars that usually go about an hour, what do you think? Do you like the shorter ones better? Do you like the longer ones? Would you rather I'd done the whole thing in just one? What's your thought on that? Feel free to just put that in the chat if you'd like to.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. We love your feedback.
Yeah. But in the meantime, thanks for joining us and just really appreciate it. So let's see. Oh, Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer. My friend Jennifer is on. She says, I love it longer depending on the topic. Jennifer, I agree with you. I tend to like the longer ones because once I'm on a roll, I want to keep going with the topic. So Leanne says, I don't like to cram in more than you have time for, so it depends. Leanne, that's a really good point. Maybe the rule is base it on the topic. Make the webinar the right length for the topic. So if it needs to be an hour, great, make it an hour. If it needs to be shorter, make it shorter. Andy says the same thing. Terrell, short is good, then opening up for questions. Yeah, Terrell, I love the questions at the end and the comments. I always learn from people's questions and comments. I see that somebody's put something in the Q&A, so let me open that up. Okay, Darrell says he's fine either way. And Darrell, would you please correct me if I'm mispronouncing your name? I hope I remember that right, but I'd like to be corrected if I'm not. Okay. Well, you guys, thank you for that input. Unless there's anything else, I think we're done, Olivia, and I'll turn the time back over to you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on February 2nd with James Tanner. He will be giving a presentation entitled Moving Beyond Birth, Marriage, and Death Records. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.